Well, at this time, what I'd like to do is introduce our speaker to you. Elizabeth Coonan is with now Denton Davis Brown law firm. And so if you hadn't heard that name change yet, this is just brand new. And I think it's still coming out. And Elizabeth may say a little bit more about that. But let me introduce her to you now. She has worked as an employment attorney with the Davis Brown law firm, as I mentioned, soon to be Denton Davis Brown. And she understands that every report of discrimination, harassment, or retaliation presents an opportunity for businesses to improve. And every complex medical return to work situation, whether that's changing COVID protocols or business visa conundrum, presents an opportunity for business to foster a better connection with employees. So Elizabeth has prepared some great remarks for us today about how to return to work. So Elizabeth, I'm going to turn everything over to you, and we are all waiting anxiously to hear what you have to share with us today.
Oh, great. Thanks so much for allowing me to be with you all today. Yes, we are now Denton's Davis Brown, and it's an even crazier transition for me. I practiced at another firm locally here in town for about 15 years. I've been doing this for almost 20 years now. I have to say the pandemic is probably the most exciting thing that's happened in the course of my practice. But I joined Davis Brown. I came over here in January of this year, just in time for us to change our name and attach ourselves to this global law firm. So as I was telling Trish, it's been very exciting. I have a whole bunch of new colleagues all over the globe. It's been great to get to know them. It's been great to share resources with them. But at the end of the day, I'm still in my downtown office with some of my colleagues. Some of them are still remote, but same old Davis Brown people that many of you probably know and work with. And when I was asked to talk about sort of some of these COVID issues, you know, it was maybe a month ago or so, and things look totally different. I mean, what's true at, 10 o'clock in the morning can be totally different by 5 p.m. given the current state of affairs. So, I'll tell you, we've been doing this for over a year. I have to feel like I'm really optimistic. I feel like we've almost made it. I think there's light at the end of the tunnel. I'm really excited about the prospect of getting back to life and, worrying about things like, how many of my friends can make it over to, Captain Roy's for happy hour. Basically, we've been at this for a year. We're going to try and forge a path forward. We've got to, I think in the past, we might have been a little bit more focused on, employees we thought were gaming the FMLA system, or employees who, maybe we thought weren't being honest with us about their work situations. But really, in actuality, now we're to the point where we need to be figuring out how to bring people back into the workplace in a safe way, and deal with all of those other HR issues that we still have going on, but deal with those sort of separately. And so I think we've got primarily a large portion of our population is vaccinated. We've got a lot of considerations about how we not only return to work safely, but make sure that our people are happy, because unemployment's at an all-time low. And I'm regularly hearing from my clients that they're having a difficult time finding people to do their work. And that means we've got to pivot, and we've got to focus on employee engagement while bringing them back safely. And so what I wanted to do today was just sort of talk about some of the laws that are implicated when we're bringing people back, and maybe some of the ways that we can use some of those laws to our advantage as we sort of navigate through this process. So, we've got the somewhat vaccinated state. We have the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. That's now largely optional. The landscape is still changing a ton. So we're going to talk about how each of these laws comes into play, and then really talk about, what are we looking at when we return to the workplace? So let's start first, if you wouldn't mind, in the chat, just saying, give me one word to describe what comes to mind for you when thinking about a full return to work, everybody back in the office. And I'll kick us off. My first one is no masks. How do we get that done? Excitement, love it. Everyone back, you got it. I mean, I think this is great. I think there is so much excitement that's fueling this return to work. People want to get back together. They want to see people. And if they don't want it on a full-time basis, what I'm hearing at least is they at least want it on a hybrid basis. So again, we've got a lot of stuff that we need to consider. So let's go ahead and kind of set the table. Ooh, yeah, sense of normalcy, definitely. Can we get that? That would be great. Yes, staggered approaches for sure, navigating levels of home work locations. We're going to talk about all of these things. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about, though, is the Back to Business Limited Liability Act. I think this is important to keep in mind because we basically have this act, and it was passed in the middle of last year, and it really protects private business owners and public entities like school districts from civil liability for COVID-19 related injuries if certain conditions are met. And so the question is, who can bring an action for COVID-19 exposure, right? That's at the top of every business owner's mind. And the legislature acted really swiftly in responding and put forth this law. And I think it's pretty good. It's got some bugs, but for the most part, basically, what it says is, look, you have to be actually injured in order to bring an action against somebody for COVID-19 exposure, okay? So in order to be eligible, the claimant has to have a positive COVID-19 diagnosis, and the COVID-19 related illness has to have led to a hospitalization or death. And then other instances of exposure, like when somebody has symptoms and they don't seek a diagnosis, or diagnosis where maybe they don't have hospitalization, that's probably not going to be actionable under the law, right? So it's really meant to address sort of those serious cases. I think business owners are also thinking about what triggers premises liability, and the Act talks about that too. Those in control of premises are liable only under specific circumstances. The person in control of the premises must have either recklessly disregarded an unnecessary risk of exposure or exposed others to COVID-19 through an act of malice or intentionally exposing people to COVID-19. We hope people don't do things like this, but if they do, at least we've got a little bit of guidance from the legislature as to what happens in those circumstances. The new law shields from liability those that have substantially complied or whose actions are consistent with guidance from state, federal, or government agencies or entities or public health authorities. So for example, if your back to business plan is consistent with CDC guidance at the time that you implement it, under the statute, you wouldn't necessarily be liable for COVID-19 exposure that might occur in the workplace. That's a great thing, right? But the takeaway here is, of course, this guidance changes all the time. So when you're putting together your back to return to work plans, or your back to the workplace plans, make sure you're keeping a static copy of the guidance that you're relying on, because it changes and it's not always archived on the sites. We saw that quite a bit, especially in the beginning with respect to workforce development and changing their FAQs and things like that. So you're going to want to just make sure you maintain documentation on that particular piece. So I want to talk a little bit about vaccines, because I think this is sort of another layer of complexity for all of us. We have hanging in the background the Back to Business Liability Act. We know what that says. But when we look at vaccines and the rollout of all the options that are available, and with all Iowans being eligible for vaccination, we've got a ton of other issues we've got to kind of sort through as employers, as people who are sort of responsible for others, and returning them to the workplace. So what we really need to kind of look at is, since the outset of the pandemic, we know that the EEOC is telling us that COVID-19 is a direct threat under the ADA. And to address that health threat, right, the public health threat, the EEOC now says that we can ask more extensive medical questions of our people and we can implement more controls in the workplace than we used to be allowed to under the ADA, right? So that's how we got to the point where we could do testing, we could do, we could have them submit to COVID tests and get the results. We could have them temp test. We could have them provide information about their background and their medical situation before they entered into the workplace. And that's all still true. We can still do all of those things. And we've lived that for several months now. Then we layer on top of that OSHA, right? OSHA requires that employers keep safe and healthy work sites through its general duties clause. And that basically says that, employers have to make sure that they protect employees against serious recognized hazards. In the context of COVID-19, employers, I think, are required to take action to mitigate the spread of the disease. And with there was supposed to be some guidance issued from OSHA on the vaccination issue. And we'll talk a little bit about what they have issued and what they haven't issued. But that's still kind of an unsettled point right now. I think Biden gave a OSHA directive to issue guidance by March 15th, but I don't think that's been issued yet. So for now, we rely on the general duty clause and some historical case law to guide us, right? So if we look next at this vaccine question, the question I have for you is, do you think it's lawful to incentivize vaccination for your employees? And if you want to throw your answer in the chat, you can, if you want to be so bold. If not, that's okay. It's really sort of a yes, no, maybe, right? Under the Trump administration, the idea of incentivizing vaccines was, I think, a little bit different than it currently is. Under Trump, I think the incentives could really only be of a very nominal value. And the current administration seems to be treating that just a little bit different and has kind of moved away from that. So we're taking the position that, look, unless the government tells us otherwise, I think employers can actually incentivize vaccination. And if you have been, watching mainstream media, you'll see stories about really large employers doing things to incentivize their people to get vaccines. Why would it? But vaccination is highly politicized, right? We always have a segment of the population that wants to get it and a segment that doesn't want to get it. Some reasons why an employer may want to do it, maybe it's a public good issue. Maybe it's because if they're running a factory, there might be some benefit to allowing employees to be closer than 6 feet apart. It could be the difference between turning out, 1,500 widgets versus 3,000, which of course would affect the bottom line. There are also benefits to being able to room for meetings, and there are social benefits, right? So some employers are pursuing that. And some of the things that they're offering include gift cards, which of course are taxable to the employee, cash, again, taxable to your employee. They're doing extra PTO. That seems to be really popular right now. I've got a few employers that are doing that. And I've got some that are, doing in that particular space. So the next question I have is, do you think it's lawful to require as a condition of employment? And I was talking with Daniel ahead of time, and we were going to do some polling questions, and we didn't get those plugged in time, but ordinarily I'd have you just give me a poll, because I love to find out what people actually think, because we're kind of nerds. We look at the law all the time, and that's how we deal. But it's interesting to know what other people are doing. I'll tell you, the EEOC guidance says that employers can mandate vaccines if there's a safety issue. But employers have to be able to make the business case for a mandate. And I think national law supports vaccination as something that is permissible, especially in the case of a public health emergency. We've got a rather large body of case law that deals with flu vaccines, right? Especially for people like frontline workers. But our current law doesn't mandate that employers require employees to get a vaccine. So if you're going to mandate, you've obviously got to be really careful of OSHA and the ADA and religious accommodation laws. Again, OSHA hasn't given us a very clear playbook, but their best practices that they've issued basically suggest making a vaccine or a vaccination series available at no cost, providing information and education and training on the benefits and safety of vaccinations is something they encourage. But perhaps the most valuable piece of guidance we have kind of forecasts why we still need to be talking about vaccines in the workplace, even if you don't mandate it. OSHA guidance specifically addresses not distinguishing between workers who are vaccinated and those who aren't. They say workers who are vaccinated must continue to follow protective measures, such as wearing a face covering and remaining physically distant, because at this time, there's not evidence that COVID-19 vaccines prevent transmission of the virus from person to person. And the CDC explains that, experts need to understand more about how the transmission process works before we can have, sort of more specific guidance on that. So there's lots to consider on the vaccination front. I think hopefully as an organization, you all have decided how you're going to handle your vaccines. They're available. And, I guess with things sort of opening up and the lid coming off of the availability, process and access, the one thing that I think we might be apt to forget is this idea of retaliation. We've got OSHA, who has been clearly telling us that they're going to be stepping up enforcement efforts, and that's going to include efforts to ensure employees are aware of their rights with respect to retaliation. And so I think regardless of whatever your policy is, it's a good time to remind employees, especially if you're operating in an environment where vaccination is encouraged but not required, that vaccination is a personal decision, and there might be reasons why a colleague doesn't have the vaccination, and we won't permit retaliation against them for their decisions. And so I think, to the extent that you have those issues crop up, I think they're just important to kind of keep an eye on. I mentioned that there are some ADA and religious considerations. If you are going to mandate vaccines, I think the law is very clear that you have to have some carve-outs, right? You've got to have carve-outs for people who have a documented disability or medical condition that's going to be aggravated by the vaccine. And then also, if somebody has a bona fide religious belief that prevents them or precludes them from getting the vaccine, you're going to have to dig into that with them. I had an employer who did mandate vaccines, and they had a bunch of people come forward and say, look, that's fine that you want to mandate vaccines, but I'm not going to get it because I'm politically opposed. And I think that that can be kind of a slippery slope. I think in those circumstances, you really do have to kind of dig in with the employee and figure out why they're politically opposed. Because a lot of times, some of that political opposition can be rooted in religion. It's just that the employee presents it as political opposition. So something to keep in mind if you're looking at mandating vaccines. I want to say a little bit about the FFCRA, because this was like all the hot news, all the rage last year, right? It was a law that was put together sort of in haste. It's a little bit buggy. We spent a really long time trying to figure out what it said, who it applied to. Now I feel like we're all sort of old hat at it. But we can't ignore the role that it's going to play in return to work. It's kind of a mess, but it's still alive in some respects. So basically where we've been is when, this was enacted last year, we all had to scramble and we interpreted it. And now we know that, it generally provided for 2 weeks or up to 80 hours of paid sick leave at the employee's regular rate of pay if the employee was unable to work because they were quarantined or experiencing COVID-19 symptoms, or if they were seeking a medical diagnosis, or they got 2 weeks of paid sick at 2/3 the employee's regular rate of pay because they were unable to work because of a bona fide need to care for an individual that was subject to a quarantine, or if they had those school closures, or if they had something that was a condition that was similar to COVID, but not COVID. Perfect. Okay. So we were talking about families first. We know what it says. We know how we operated until December 31st when it sunsetted. But we now know, of course, January 1st of this year began a period where we had an option to allow our people to actually take FFCRA leave. and we could claim the tax credit. A lot of businesses chose to continue that benefit. Some did not. But now, as we currently sit, this is it is an optional law, right? And so one of my polling questions was, I'm just curious, how many people are voluntarily actually doing the FFCRA? It's a great deal from a tax perspective, but I understand why, from an administrative perspective, folks might not necessarily want to do that. But the bottom line is, if you are still allowing your people that leave, you can get the tax credit. But, and this is a big but, because we have the American Rescue Plan. And that's the thing that I think most people really need to pay attention to. It's the newest, it's the most, I think it provides some really kind of interesting changes to the law. And we're not seeing a ton of people talking about it. And that could be because it is still because it's still optional. But it's got some things in it that if you are actually voluntarily providing that family's first leave, you need to be aware of. So under the American Rescue Plan signed into law by Biden in March, the payroll tax credits are extended to September 30th of this year. And that's for both the EPSL and for the EFMLA. It does not reinstate the employer mandate. Okay, so again, participation is still voluntary. The plan also changes the entitlement to emergency FMLA pay. Previously, the first 2 weeks of EFMLA were unpaid. Under the American Rescue Plan, all 12 weeks can be paid, and the emergency FMLA benefits have been expanded to include all of the reasons that an employee can take emergency paid sick leave. So it's a far more robust benefit, right? Under the original FFCRA, emergency FMLA was only available for school or childcare issues. The American Rescue Plan also changed the maximum payment to $200 a day and increased from $10,000 to $12,000 total, which makes sense. The plan also expands the type of leave under FFCRA. So leave can now be taken when the employee is obtaining the vaccination, when the employee is suffering or recovering from side effects related to the vaccination, which some of us know about and some of us felt rather deeply, or when the employee is seeking or waiting for the results of a COVID test. They get coverage under that law. If they were exposed or if the employee requested the test. So there are lots of facets that kind of come into play. So if you're voluntarily offering that law, I think you need to be aware of the fact that there are some expansions that have been made available, and we want to make sure that you're adhering to those and sort of being a knowing buyer on that. The law also has an anti-discrimination provision. Basically means that if an employer is voluntarily offering FFCRA leave to one person, it's got to be offered to everybody, which I think makes good sense. But if you want to offer EPSL, but not EFMLA, you can do that too. So there's a little bit of flexibility built in there. The final thing that I want to call to your attention is the fact that the law resets the amount of EPSL available under the FFCRA starting April 1st. So if you use 10 days of your allotment in 2020, you basically get a fresh new bank of leave. And if you continue to offer that leave, you can claim a tax credit for up to 10 days if you've got somebody with qualifying EPSL leave after April 1st of 2021. So let's talk about, moving towards returning our people to work and considering sort of some of the circumstances, right? So we've got a couple of scenarios I just want to run through. These are things that I'm seeing pop up pretty regularly. We'll have somebody who says, employer, you don't have a mandatory vaccine policy. I don't trust my coworkers to vaccinate and or be safe. I want to work remotely forever. We're getting a lot of these I want to work remotely forever requests. And so if you haven't already started making plans to address that question, I think you need to. In this scenario, you have a couple of things to unpack. first, if you decided to make the vaccine mandatory, what's the penalty for noncompliance? You're going to have to navigate that particular piece. Assuming you've worked that out and you can articulate a safety need for the mandate, the situation's really going to require a conversation with your employee. Is the employee mistrusting the, I think what we want to know, like, what's driving the request to work remotely? Is it mistrust of coworkers, or is it some other concern? Do they just really truly enjoy working in their PJs? Some people love that, right? Are there accommodations that are going to allow the employee to come back to work in a safe and comfortable manner? I think there's a lot of fear out there, but as we become more of a vaccinated population, hopefully some of that fear subsides. And at the end of the day, as the employer, you can set the venue for work. Your company might decide that, employees can work remotely, and that's great. If that's the case, make sure you have a formalized process for that, right? When we sent out everybody last March, I don't think we were thinking about things like how to ensure that the home workspace was safe. And so you have to think about that. You have to think about how you can pull back an employee who's violating the trust of the company by abusing remote work as an option. So now that we've been in this for a year, we really, if we haven't started, we need to start thinking strategically about, sort of long-term strategies for remote work. I mentioned securing the remote workspace. This could be as simple as having your employees certified they'll maintain a safe workspace. Or are you going to require audits? I've got a couple of employers who actually require audits, photographic audits, right? Send us a picture of where you're working so we can see that it's not, a huge fire hazard, right? So think about the parameters that you're gonna place around the safety piece, and then also the privilege, right? How do we revoke it if it's just not working out? Because I think, at the end of the day, you really do have the ability to call people back in if you want to. But if, for example, this person's concern is rooted in an underlying health condition, I think that conversation is entirely different. And so sometimes employers want employees to return and the employees aren't ready. And I think that just requires some tough decision making. If the request comes with a medical excuse, I think it's a lot easier. But here, I think the employee is largely free to make the decision as it wishes. So the next one I wanted to talk about a little bit is childcare and scheduling. This is something else that my partners and I are seeing a lot. I want to work a flexible schedule while working remotely. We're seeing a lot of requests for permanent remote work. And some of that is kind of tied to a little bit of a different fact pattern. So in the fall, parents needed flexibility to homeschool children. That happened last spring, that happened a little bit this fall. And I think everybody sort of navigated those waters as best we could. In the early stages, employees who were charged with providing care to children due to COVID-related school or daycare closures could work with their employers to take, intermittent job protected leave under the FFCRA if that was something that applied to your company. If you have, or those employers elected to extend it, there's some controls in place for that. But, for now, we've got a little bit of a different situation, right? Because for the most part, children are back in the classroom, and we've got employers now struggling with remote employees who have a drop in productivity, or they're unable to be reached during certain hours of the day. Now, whether it be a cost-saving measure for the family or driven by some other need, with technology being what it is, for smaller employers, tracking employee productivity can be pretty tough. For larger employers, I think it's less tough. But I think at the end of the day, the fact remains that we do get to set the schedule. And so if you've got an employee who's consistently unavailable, I think that's going to require a conversation before you take some action. And we have to make sure that we're taking, we're documenting the conversations that we have with our people around this remote work issue, so that we can determine, is it childcare related? Is it disability related? And really sort of getting to the root cause. Because at the end of the day, once you vet those issues, if you still have productivity or performance issues, for somebody who's working remote, then you're going to have to deal with those. I think that these arrangements can be successful. Any return to work situation that involves, maybe it's a hybrid, or maybe it involves, having people, work remotely on a permanent basis, they can be successful. They just need to have the right structure. And I think the parties need to be honest about their commitment to the work. So, if as an employer, you need people to work certain hours, then we should make it a condition of employment and be prepared to implement disciplinary action if folks are violating. And, again, this all assumes that the employee doesn't have some sort of underlying, disability or other type of available leave to them. What I will say about remote work, there was a good study done recently by PwC. They surveyed 133 US company executives and 1,200 US office workers between November 24th and December 5th of last year to see how effective remote work has been. And the employee respondents were either required to work from home because of the pandemic, or they did routinely anyway, right? And the study is interesting because it excluded essential workers. Okay, so those folks are off the table. So the question basically was asked, how successful would you say the shift to remote work because of COVID-19 has been for your company? And a whopping 83% of employers reported that it was successful. And then interestingly enough, on the employee side, 71% of the employees reported that it's been successful. So you've got a disparity there between your employees and your employers, which for me really just highlights the fact that we have to keep an open line of communication with our people to understand, do they believe they can be successful in a remote work atmosphere if that's something that you're actually looking at implementing on a long-term basis. We don't know. We didn't have any data on what accounts for the deficit between the two. It could be, the pressure to perform and live and work in close quarters or homeschool. That could certainly lead to a lack of positive feelings about remote work. But the fact of the matter is we don't know unless we ask our people. And, I've reviewed a sampling of other surveys, which largely indicated that employers have been generally happy with the remote work option. But again, it's within your purview to dictate where the work is performed, unless you've got some other sort of underlying disability or other related issue, religious issues and things like that. So when we're looking at how to solve this issue of bringing people back and what we do with them, I think we need to do a few things. We've got to look at our policies. What do our current policies say about how our people perform their work? And let's make sure that if we have remote work policies in place, they're very clear about when we can withdraw that permission and under what conditions. If you don't have a remote work policy in place, you probably should have one if you're going to have your people out, right? If you are, I'd say in that vein too, make sure that we've got an ADA process trigger. If somebody tells us they have a disabling condition, that just requires different analysis. It doesn't mean that, it doesn't mean that we can't accommodate. We should be looking at accommodations, but we got to keep those religious issues and those disability issues sort of front of mind when we're trying to figure out, do we bring people in on a hybrid basis, or do we keep them out in, entirely remotely, or do we bring them all back in? And then finally, my big thing is OSHA. It's sort of the elephant in the room. We know it's out there. We're still waiting on that guidance. We all kind of think we know what it's going to say, but I would just consider that, we got to look at OSHA, not only from the regular worksite perspective, which I think we all think of on a regular basis, but, we've got to think about it in terms of how our employees are operating when they're working remotely and what that looks like for them. And is it going to be safe, right? So the bottom line is that, I think remote work is here to stay in some form, and we're going to have a difficult time denying it as a reasonable accommodation for the foreseeable future. So, so all of those issues, when people come to you with those particular isolated incidences of, I really want to work from home and you want me to come back into the workplace, it's really going to take that that in-depth conversation with your employee to get to the root of what's driving their request for remote work. And if it is in fact medically related and you have a doctor certifying that, remote work is the only way, that we're going to have some tough decisions to make. So I think, we make sure that we communicate with our people about our expectations and we document our processes. So with all of that, I've left some time so that we can actually just talk. And I think we've got at least a few minutes. If we've got questions, I'd love to take them. And with the caveat, of course, that I should have given at the beginning that, whatever I said at the beginning might be different now, an hour later.
And Elizabeth, do you also need to switch back to that disclaimer slide real quick too, as you take questions?
Oh yeah, I probably should. Yeah, thanks for that. I probably should.
So certainly, yeah, if people want to unmute and ask questions, that's perfectly fine. Diane, I saw your question there in the chat. I tried to look up the PwC report myself. I think that's the website. And so you'll at least get some information there, whether it's exactly what Elizabeth had referenced or not, I'm not sure, but.
That looks about right. Let me pull it up here. Yeah, it's a really interesting study.
There, yeah.
Yeah, yep, that's the one. You got it.
Perfect.
It's an interesting study. I mean, it's, remote work it's here to stay in some format. It's all just going to be business dependent.
So feel free to unmute yourselves if you have any additional questions you'd like to ask.
This is Marianne with Catch Des Moines. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
And we actually have a really good social distancing mask policy in our office, and returning to the office is strictly voluntary. But that said, what if you have a coworker who refuses to wear a mask? I mean, but your policy, so hypothetical, but your policy does ask that you wear a mask when you're not in your, cubicle or office. Do you just approach your supervisor, your boss? I mean, I'm wondering, what should you do and what are the repercussions?
Yeah, it's I kind of look at it from two perspectives, right? From the employee perspective, that could make your employees that are on site fearful, right? And, unsafe, which isn't good. From the employer's perspective, I'd want to know about that. If I was in management, I'd want to know about that. I think you run that up the chain, and I think you alert human resources and let them know that, this is problematic because we've got this policy that says we're supposed to wear masks and this person's not wearing their mask. And then I think it's incumbent upon the employer to decide, how strictly they're going to enforce their mask policy. I've got some employers that are zero tolerance. If you're not wearing your mask, you're getting written up because it's a safety violation, right? If you've got somebody who's consistently not going to adhere to the safety protocols that the organization has put in place, and those safety protocols are consistent with the state and federal guidance, I think that, potentially could end up resulting in termination for that person, if not, disciplinary action before that. So yeah, I mean, if a business has a policy, there has to be a reason to have that policy. And if it's still good reason to have a mask policy, given the current state of affairs, and the CDC is saying that you should, and the IDPH is saying that you should, I think that's grounds for disciplinary action.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions for folks? Hopefully not everybody's asleep, but sometimes that happens.
This is Trish. Sorry, I'm trying to get to my, this has been fantastic information. And, and I may have missed this. I had to take a phone call earlier, but when you were talking about the vaccine, is it correct that an employer cannot mandate it while it is in the, before it's FDA approved? Is that correct? But after it's been FDA, because we're in a special use emergency status or whatnot.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think they can. I think employers can, as long as they have a reasonable safety basis for doing it. I just think that you got to be careful about how you do it. I think that they can, but and the employee would have the right to vote with their feet, right? If they don't want to get it and they don't have some sort of religious objection, and they don't have some sort of disability or disability connected or medically connected reason for not getting it, then the employee would have to decide, do I really want to work here? I do think that employers can mandate. I think it's a little bit dicey. I don't think it comes without risk. I mean, in the fact that, we are all, putting this stuff in our bodies and we don't really know what it is. It's a great question, Trish, but I think they can. I think they can mandate it as long as they, have some sort of, true safety justification for it.
Sure. No, and I heard that question before, and it's interesting, and I agree with what you said earlier. It became political when it never should have, unfortunately. And now I think that businesses are trying to deal with that.
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough. We saw this morning, there were a whole bunch of new lawsuits related to COVID that just came out, vaccination lawsuits, kind of along those lines. And, I don't know, amongst practitioners, we all kind of think, they're probably not gonna survive. They're probably gonna fail. The ones that were highlighted this morning that I was reading about were related to employees in a detention center, I think somewhere in the South. And, it just, I don't know. I don't think I think there'll be more litigation surrounding COVID. I just do. There's vaccination litigation, there's safety standard protocols. The Back to Business Liability Act will provide employers with some protection, but I still think we're going to see more. We're certainly seeing an uptick in, of course, the workers' compensation claims and things like that. So it's out there. It's all out there. We'll see what happens tomorrow, right?
Right. Every day it changes.
Right. It's the truth. It's the truth.
Anybody else have any other questions? This has been just amazing information. And just so you know, we will patch together as best as we can. Hopefully Daniel knows how to do that, or Andy, our marketing company, and we will get this video out. There's just too much great information in here. And we know that many of our employees or employers are struggling to, how do we bring our employees back? Is it necessary? And what is it that we need to do? And just great information. So thank you, Elizabeth.
Oh, I'm happy to do it. Just make sure you put my disclaimer on there, Daniel.
We'll make sure we get that added. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing this information.
I mean, what would a lawyer talk be without a disclaimer?
Well, yes, this has been fantastic. Great information. And I know that a lot of people have been very anxious to hear what you had to share today. So it's been very helpful. Well, everyone, I do want to let you know there are still a few events coming up with the Chamber over the next couple of weeks. So make sure you take a look at the Chamber calendar. We have our first in-person morning fuel networking that's happening next week. So take a look at that. There's a nonprofit forum about development and training coming up, and several other events. Make sure you take a look at the annual award celebration if you're not already registered for that. Register for that soon. We're going to have a lot of fun handing out awards to our own members for their accomplishments last year. So with that, everyone, thanks for attending today. And once again, thank you to MediaCom Business for being our sponsor today, and to Elizabeth from Denton's Davis Brown for sharing this information with us today. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.